A 2,000 square foot fortress in the New Mexico desert, built for human trafficking, dark scientific experiments, and genetic breeding. For decades, federal authorities refused to search it, but files unsealed in 2026 reveal terrifying new claims, including tracking devices surgically implanted into victims. Epstein planned to freeze his brain and genitals here to create his baby ranch vision. Today, we're looking at the horrors of Zorro Ranch and why the Department of Justice is actively blocking this investigation. Eddie Aragon got an email on November 19, just 3 months after Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell. He stared at the message from an anonymous sender claiming to be a former employee at Epstein's New Mexico compound known as Zorro Ranch. The demand was the ransom of one single Bitcoin, which was valued at the time at approximately $8,000. The coordinates were supposedly the precise location of 2 foreign girls buried somewhere in the hills outside the ranch. The sender claimed the girls died by strangulation during rough sex on the orders of Epstein and his accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell. Aragon sent the email to the FBI on November 25, 2019. Federal agents made a report noting that the email address had already been deactivated and filed the report away. 7 years would go by. On March 9th, 2026, agents from the New Mexico State Police and the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office finally entered the gates of the Zorro compound to execute a search warrant of the desert ranch. The search was triggered by the furor from the Epstein Files Transparency Act of 2025. The files exposed systemic, decades-long failure by federal authorities to investigate Zorro Ranch. Behind the iron gates at 340 Rancho San Rafael in Stanley, New Mexico, Epstein built a fortress designed for the exploitation of young women. Epstein required privacy, vast acreage, and to be close to his powerful networks. And he got all 3 of these on a high desert mesa straddling a geographic fault line approximately 30 miles south of Santa Fe, New Mexico. In 1993, Epstein bought the property from the family of Bruce King, a 3-time governor of New Mexico. He purchased 7,500 acres for about $3.75 million. Gary King, the governor's son, would become Attorney General of New Mexico. In 2006, his campaign received a $15,000 donation from Epstein, which King would not return, later stating he was unaware of any wrongdoing by Epstein at the time. Epstein expanded the footprint of the ranch. In 2001 and 2004, he got more territory, getting 7,622 acres of private land. He would also lease an additional 1,243 acres of state trust land surrounding the property through a shell company called Cypress Inc. In 1999, Epstein completed construction of the main residence. The mansion was built in a sprawling hacienda style and is approximately 28,636 square feet. The living room alone is the size of most people's houses. The environment was fortified. No trespassing signs were plastered in the outer perimeter, and a large double gate blocked access to the property from the main road. Surveillance cameras were all over the property. The public trust land leased by Cypress Inc. was entirely within the borders of the fencing, which means that state land inspectors could not access public property unless they went through Epstein's fortified gates, which the ranch staff consistently blocked. Inside the perimeter of those gates, Epstein built an airport to traffic victims undetected. He built a private airstrip long enough to accommodate mid-sized jets, a massive airplane hangar, and a helicopter pad. The property also has a 7-bay heated garage, a private firehouse, a log cabin, guest houses, and of course, a pool. Epstein's goal was to use Zorro Ranch as the headquarters for a massive insemination program. He planned to have up to 20 women impregnated with his sperm and housed at the facility simultaneously. The scale and isolation of the ranch were intended to provide absolute privacy for the operation, isolating the women and the resulting children. To find women he deemed worthy, Epstein exploited access to academic circles. He would use dinner parties to screen candidates. He would intentionally invite attractive women with impressive academic credentials to assess their biological and intellectual suitability to bear his children. Now, there's no evidence that the baby ranch breeding facility ever went beyond Epstein's bizarre fantasies, but the property was used as a hub for trafficking and abusing young women. Epstein also planned to have his head and his penis frozen using cryonics after his death. He wanted to freeze his head to preserve his brain, which he believed to be intellectually superior to the general population. And by freezing his genitals, he felt it would preserve his ability to reproduce and spread his DNA. See, Epstein bought into transhumanism, the belief that the human race can evolve beyond its current physical limitations through science and technology. He was convinced that future advancements in genetic engineering and artificial intelligence would make resurrection possible. Again, there's no evidence that Epstein's cryogenic wishes were ever fulfilled. He died in federal prison in 2019, and his body was placed in the custody of the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, where an autopsy was performed. Cryogenic preservation is a delicate process that requires a body to be rapidly cooled and pumped with medical-grade cryoprotectants within minutes of death. The timeline is impossible to achieve when a death occurs unexpectedly in a jail cell. After his autopsy, his remains were reportedly claimed by his brother and buried in an unmarked grave in Florida next to his parents. A disturbing addition was a large white yurt erected on the grounds. In early 2026, an anonymous tipster broke through the security perimeter and photographed the exterior of the mansion and documented the inside of the yurt. The photos, which were emailed to New Mexico lawmakers, showed a statue of an African man and a medical defibrillator. The tipster also provided photos of freshly dug up burial plots on the property, speculating that evidence had been removed. Zorro Ranch was designed for containment. The extreme isolation of the property, combined with high-tech surveillance, meant that anyone brought onto the property was trapped within the borders of the private estate. The physical abuse inside the property was largely sealed in the federal court dockets until Judge Loretta Preska ordered the unsealing of the documents from the settled defamation lawsuit between Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell. The deposition transcripts exposed how the Zorro Ranch worked. According to the federal filings, Epstein flew in guests and underage victims under the guise of massage therapy. Inside the compound, the environment was monitored. Annie Farmer, the fourth accuser to testify at Maxwell's trial, stated that she was flown to the ranch in 1996 when she was 16 years old. She testified that Maxwell gave her a nude massage on a table. The following morning, Epstein lumbered into her bed. He told her he wanted to cuddle. Farmer testified she felt frozen as Epstein pressed his body into hers. She escaped the bed by claiming she urgently needed to use the restroom. Another survivor, identified in court as Jane Doe, recalled meeting Epstein during a school trip in New York. She and her sister were invited to a magic show in Las Vegas, then immediately flown on Epstein's private plane to Zorro Ranch. This Jane Doe stated she was summoned to the main house and brought directly to Epstein's bedroom. Epstein was wearing a bathrobe and demanded a massage. As he became frustrated with her lack of understanding regarding his sexual demands, he pinned her down and assaulted her with a device. Another Jane Doe reported being flown to the ranch in 2004 when she was 15 years old. She testified that the abuse began upon arrival and continued for hours. While pinned to the floor of the room, she looked up and saw framed photos on a dresser showing Epstein with powerful political figures. Epstein abused her while pointing to the photos, lecturing her on how beneficial the experience could be for her future. Virginia Giuffre submitted 4 photographs of herself at the New Mexico compound into the federal record. I was approximately 17 at the time, judging from the looks of it. Giuffre alleged under oath that she was trafficked to powerful men at the ranch, explicitly naming the late New Mexico governor Bill Richardson, who served from 2003 to 2011. A spokesperson for Richardson denied the allegations, saying the governor never met Giuffre and never saw underage girls in Epstein's presence. The control over the victims extended beyond just physical containment. On June 19, 2026, survivor Annette Church testified before the New Mexico Truth Commission and detailed the surveillance state operating within the Zorro Ranch, stating that cameras were installed directly inside the bathrooms. Church then would provide a horrifying new allegation regarding physical modifications performed on the victims to prevent their escape. A tracker was placed in my tooth, a surveillance device was placed in or on another tooth, and some kind of poison capsule or poison tooth was placed in another tooth or replaced my normal tooth. Most of these things were later removed by Epstein himself. The operation was massive and ignored by law enforcement. In February 2007, FBI agents briefly visited Zorro Ranch. They interviewed Bryce Gordon, the ranch manager. Gordon admitted to federal agents that Epstein frequently flew in guests and masseuses and actively hired local massage therapists to work at the compound. The 2007 FBI interview with Gordon was abruptly terminated when an unknown individual called the ranch and ordered the staff to stop speaking with the agents. The FBI agents left. Federal authorities did not execute a search warrant on the property, and 12 years would pass. Epstein's grip on the property would begin to slip after his arrest in July 2019. Despite the federal indictment in New York triggering raids across his properties in Manhattan and the Virgin Islands, a December 2019 email from the federal prosecutors confirmed that federal agents had not searched the New Mexico property. So state officials began working to investigate the property. On September 4th, 2019, New Mexico Commissioner of Public Lands Stephanie Garcia Richard pulled the trigger on Epstein's 1,243-acre state trust land lease. Garcia Richards sent a formal cancellation letter to Cypress Inc., the Epstein-controlled shell company holding the grazing leases since 1993. Cypress Inc. would hire an Albuquerque law firm to contest the cancellation, but would eventually settle and drop its contest of the cancellation. Also in 2019, New Mexico Attorney General Hector Balderas opened a criminal investigation into the activities at Zorro Ranch. His office interviewed multiple survivors and gathered evidence. Before Balderas could move toward prosecution, the U.S. Department of Justice intervened. Federal prosecutors requested that New Mexico halt its investigation to avoid interfering with their parallel investigation. Balderas complied, providing all reports and interviews to the DOJ and pausing the state inquiry. With the state investigation stopped by the Department of Justice and the FBI failing to search the ranch, the property just sat there. On February 16, 2026, the New Mexico State House passed a resolution in the Epstein Truth Commission. On February 19, 2026, New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torrez announced the reopening of the state's criminal investigation. Torrez deployed special agents and prosecutors to hunt down leads generated by the Transparency Act files, working with the Legislative Truth Commission. On March 9, 2026, agents from the New Mexico Department of Justice, the New Mexico State Police, and the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office executed a search warrant of Zorro Ranch. The Legislative Committee would issue 14 high-level subpoenas on June 1, 2026. The state investigation would again collide with the Department of Justice in Washington. Attorney General Raul Torrez needed the unredacted files to prosecute any co-conspirators in New Mexico. In February 2026, he submitted a formal request to the U.S. Department of Justice. The DOJ ignored the request for months. On June 30th, 2026, Torrez would escalate, releasing a letter addressed to the acting U.S. Attorney General Todd Blanche. Despite verbal assurances of cooperation from the U.S. Department of Justice, access to the requested records has not been granted. No substantive response has been provided, and more than 130 days have passed. The U.S. Department of Justice withholding of unredacted records is causing real and escalating harm to the New Mexico Department of Justice criminal investigation. The response from the Department of Justice was to publicly rebuke the New Mexico Attorney General on social media. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche would testify before a Senate confirmation hearing that his office was continuing to work with state authority. But the reality is the federal government, which had forced New Mexico to stop its investigation in 2019, was now legally barring the state from accessing the exact names, dates, and locations required to execute search warrants and secure indictments in 2026. As the politicians and prosecutors engaged in a legal war, the evidence at Zorro Ranch was changing hands. In 2011, the Epstein estate listed the 8,000 remaining acres of the private land on the market for $27.5 million. No buyers were willing to purchase the property at $27.5 million, so the asking price was dropped to $18 million. In August 2023, the property finally sold at public auction to a newly registered entity called the San Rafael Ranch LLC. The LLC is tied to Mary Catherine Huffines and the family of Don Huffines, a Dallas real estate magnate and former Republican state senator. Huffines publicly stated that he would grant immediate access to law enforcement for any ongoing investigations, and the New Mexico Department of Justice stated that the new owners did cooperate fully during their March 2026 search of the premises. The compound is now undergoing a massive rebranding. The name Zorro Ranch has been erased. The property is now called Rancho de San Rafael, after the patron saint of healing. According to a social media post by Don Huffines, the desert fortress is going to be redeveloped and operated as a Christian retreat. Today, the state of New Mexico's investigation remains paralyzed by the Department of Justice, and the 28,000 square foot mansion sits silent in the desert, its crimes hidden in blacked out federal records, waiting for a legal reckoning that remains permanently stalled by the Department of Justice in Washington. Please stay spooky.